IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, folks, and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm joined today after a long time by my old friend and crony, Anirudh Kanisetti. Anirudh, it's been a long time since we've done an episode like this, hasn't it?
Yes, it's been months. I don't think we've done this since like April or something. It's been quite a few months.
Since you became an independent scholar.
Yes.
Right. So I want to ask you, today's episode is, we're not going to do like regular history. What we want to try and attempt is something more imaginative, like an alternate history, trying to speculate what might have been. And what we're talking about today specifically is Vijayanagara and what if it had survived. If you visit the ruins at Hampi, it's obviously awe-inspiring and poignant at the same time. And if you've read Robert Sewell's account of the fall of Vijayanagara, it can give you goose pimples. But of course, that account has been challenged quite a bit since it was written in 1900. And what we're going to look at is come to a more complicated understanding of Vijayanagara and its legacy, and to try and imagine what it might have been if this empire had actually survived, right? Because the traditional accounts, say from Sewell's time, or his other contemporaries like Krishnaswamy Iyengar, for them, Vijayanagara was this bulwark of Hindu polities. For Iyengar, the Marathas were the clear successors of Vijayanagara. But our understanding today is more complicated and I dare say more interesting. So Anirudh, let's just talk about Vijayanagara, but before we get into what might have been, let's talk about what we know actually happened. 1565, the Battle of Talikota. This is something you and I have covered on an episode of Yuddha, and you've also done an amazing video later on the battle. So can you just run us through the Battle of Talikota, the collapse of the empire, and its continuation in this very diminished form?
Sure. So thank you, Aditya. It's an absolute pleasure to be back on All Things Policy, and it's a real pleasure to be chit-chatting with my old pal again, and to be restarting, as it were, our old tradition of our Friday chit-chats about history. So I think it's appropriate that we're going to start with something that we ended the last season of Yuddha on, because we're actually coming back with a new season of Yuddha within just a few weeks. I know a lot of you guys have been asking us for months about when Yuddha is coming back, and we're finally able to give you an answer. So we're going to be starting Yuddha again in the last week of August or so with an episode about the Mughal Emperor Babur and what he did in North India. But that's of course a very distant parallel, though it might touch upon what we're discussing today about Vijayanagara, because of course in an alternate timeline that in which Vijayanagara actually survived, you could very well have had a situation where at some point of time Vijayanagara and the Mughals actually fought on an open battlefield. But we'll come to that later in this episode, hopefully. So first, the Battle of Talikota. The Battle of Talikota is very often seen as essentially the climactic moment of Vijayanagara, right? The way that Sewell and Krishnaswamy Iyengar, Neelakanta Shastri write about it, it's essentially the end of quote-unquote Hindu South India as we know it. It's this grand standoff between the armies of Hindu South India and the Muslim Northern Deccan, where Muslim treachery essentially lays low the glorious might of Vijayanagara and leads to the city being brutally and horribly sacked. Now, it's a great story, but the reality is, as always, far more complicated. So essentially what had been happening in the lead up to the battle is that the ruler of Vijayanagara at the time, a chap called Ramaraya, commonly known today as Aliya Ramaraya, because of his status as the son-in-law of the famous Vijayanagara ruler Krishnaraya, earlier Ramaraya had been pursuing a fairly remarkably successful policy. In fact, if it had been successful, he would have far outshadowed his predecessor Krishnaraya as one of the greatest of all Vijayanagara emperors. And what Ramaraya's policy basically consisted of was the consolidation of power within his family, the Aravidus, and the distribution of lands among his loyalists, especially in the regions corresponding to modern Rayalaseema. And other loyalists such as the Madurai and Ikkeri Nayakas, who were also basically battle mates of Ramaraya, worked together with him to create essentially this mobile strike force that frequently crossed the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers and created all kinds of problems for the sultanates. And the sultanates were all bound to Ramaraya through ties of patronage, through ties of loyalty. Two of the sultans, the Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur and Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah of Golconda, were his personal proteges and really owed their thrones to him in some ways. And the other major sultan, who was Hussein Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar, had a much more fractious relationship with Ramaraya, but generally speaking, he alone was not enough to take on the might of Vijayanagara, especially without Bijapur and Golconda to support him. Of course, there were a couple of other sultanates also in the picture, Bidar and Berar, but those guys were so insignificant, they played practically no role in the geopolitics of the northern Deccan. Now, what had been happening in the immediate lead up to 1565 and the Battle of Talikota is that it seems that Ramaraya was getting either pushy or paranoid. We can't really tell which, given the fact that he didn't leave a diary for us to read. But the long and short of what he was trying to do was that he was trying to shore up his power in Vijayanagara by associating himself with the imperial legacy of this very famous dynasty called the Chalukyas of Kalyana. This again is something that we've talked about in Yuddha. If you guys are interested, it's in the very first episode. But the Chalukyas of Kalyana cast this shadow not just over Vijayanagara but also over the Deccan Sultanate, specifically Bijapur. And what Ramaraya was doing towards the end of his reign is that he adopted the title of Chalukya Chakravarti, or a Chalukya Emperor, and also claimed to be he who has captured or recaptured Kalyana, and he also claimed the title of the Lord of the city of Kalyana, and distributed titles related to Kalyana to many of his loyalists and immediate family members. Now, he forced Hussein Nizam Shah, who at the time controlled Kalyana, to cede it to his protege Ali Adil Shah, but even that was not enough for Ramaraya. And there was a whole bunch of really messy things that happened. He encouraged coups against Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah. He besieged and damaged various buildings in the vicinity of Bijapur, and was basically trying to overawe the sultanates in a rather brash way compared to his deft diplomacy of previous decades. And the end result of that was that the three major sultanates, Hussein Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar, Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur, and Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah of Golconda, all pooled their forces together, had marriage alliances to bind themselves to each other, because these guys are all terrified of each other. They were really worried that any one of them might go to Ramaraya's side, and finally confronted the old Vijayanagara ruler at Talikota in 1565. Now, the long and short of the battle is that the gunpowder of the sultanates proved to be far, far more effective than Ramaraya ever anticipated. Arguably, this is one of the most decisive uses of gunpowder on any Indian battlefield, at least in the 16th century. And the end result was that the Vijayanagara army was totally smashed. Ramaraya was killed. His brothers gathered what remained of the army and came back to Vijayanagara and tried to evacuate the city, but they, of course, were not fully successful. And the Sultanate's armies arrived very soon after that and pretty savagely sacked the city, destroyed some major temples, not all of them, and left the city as a shadow of its former self. The end result was essentially the collapse of the city of Vijayanagara, but the empire itself continued because of the power that had been vested in the Aravidu family. They continued to be rulers in a fairly kind of pathetic form. It's interesting that that Krishnaswamy Iyengar claims that the Marathas were the successors of Vijayanagara, given that Vijayanagara did have legitimate successors in southern India. Mysore, for example, claimed the legacy of Vijayanagara, though Mysore had actually revolted against Vijayanagara on multiple occasions before that. Then you had a whole bunch of other Nayakas rising up who really learned a lot of lessons from the fall of Vijayanagara especially in the field of fortification. So if you look at the Chitradurga forts, you'll see the Nayakas there like really invested in very expansive fortifications that would have worked very well against gunpowder. But further south, especially in the Tamil countries, where you see the most interesting successes of Vijayanagara, especially the Tanjore and the Madurai Nayakas, these guys are essentially Telugu-speaking peasants who migrated into the Tamil country along with Vijayanagara and who turned themselves into agents of the imperial court, or at least that's how they started off. In practice, they often hired themselves out as mercenaries to existing Tamil power centers and then gradually became their own men and kind of ruled over the land in their own right. So they never really claimed the title of king because technically, even after the fall of Vijayanagara, they wanted to present themselves as nothing more than the agents of the Vijayanagara leaders, the Vijayanagara emperors. So they would use the title of Nayaka or leader. And the culture of these Nayakas in Tamil Nadu is very interesting because they have this very unique kind of approach to kingship that emphasizes public consumption, that emphasizes these very flamboyant displays of wealth and of patronage, of poetry, and especially of erotic poetry. So a lot of the poetry of the 17th, 18th centuries from Tanjore, especially in Telugu, ranks among the most extraordinary creations ever made. So Vijayanagara, in a lot of senses, did not really end that day in 1565. And more importantly, even north of the Krishna River, the Sultanates really did engage quite deeply with the legacy of Vijayanagara. If you look at Golconda, for example, it extensively patronized Telugu, perhaps not at the same rate as Vijayanagara did, but to a very considerable extent. And Bijapur, especially, just like Vijayanagara had, engaged quite extensively with the Chalukya legacy. You see that inscriptions of the Chalukyas were actually placed by Brahmins in the employ of the Bijapur court on various gates at eye level to kind of associate Bijapuri kingship with that of the Chalukyas for those who knew who the Chalukyas were. And we also have various examples of temples that were converted to mosques. Now, very often this is seen as this act of like horrific appropriation by quote-unquote evil invaders. But the reality of it is somewhat more complex. There's this beautiful temple in Bankapura, which was essentially modified just very slightly to add in a little kind of entrance and to add in a mihrab, to turn it into a hall of worship, a mosque for the faithful. And Richard Eaton and Philip Wagner, in their book Power Memory Architecture, argue that rather than seeing this as equivalent to, for example, the Delhi Sultans breaking temples and using that to build a mosque, this is actually much more akin to the Ottomans converting the Church of Saint Sophia to the Mosque Hagia Sophia, where they're trying to associate themselves with the legacy of this kingship that they knew, and they kind of took inspiration from, and to show their respect and their kind of incorporation of this cultural fabric into their own ideas of kingship. So what does all this tell us? All this tells us that Vijayanagara's fall is really far more complicated than we might like to think. And Vijayanagara itself, if you look at it during the reign of Aliya Ramaraya, was not as much of a quote-unquote purely Hindu bulwark as we might like to think. In fact, there were multiple occasions during the 16th century when Bijapur was expelling Persians and promoting the use of Kannada and Marathi, and Vijayanagara was actually importing these Persians and putting them to use in their armies and in their courts and so on. We also have a lot of examples of Vijayanagara using a Persianate costume, Persianate dress. We have a very fascinating letter by this ambassador from the Timurid court called Abdur Razak, where he describes the Vijayanagara ruler Devaraya II wearing the stole cloth cap and flowing cloth robes that would have been very similar to those that were in fashion in Samarkand or in any other Persianate court. So Vijayanagara is a much more complex polity than we like to think, and its fall is also far more complex, which of course begs the question of what would have happened if it actually survived.
Absolutely, and that is the really fascinating question for us to answer. Just going by everything that you just told us right now, if anyone's wondering how this connects to the rest of the things we talk about in All Things Policy, well, for one, don't get your rivals to gang up against you. Two, military innovations can be very difficult to predict, but can be highly disruptive. And three, elites always look back to the past to appropriate symbols of political legitimacy for themselves. But Anirudh, here's what's really interesting to me. If Vijayanagara had, say, for example, not inspired that much fear in the Deccan Sultanates and had not caused them to gang up against it, and had perhaps been more innovative in its use of new military technology, and had as a result survived. What would that empire look like, and how would it relate to the general political architecture of the Deccan and really India?
So that's a very interesting question. And since we're doing an alternate history exercise, let me just say that we're going to indulge in a little bit of imagination, of course, but we are going to base what we're going to say through this conversation on facts. We're going to base it on historical parallels. We're going to look at what happened in our timeline due to the fall of Vijayanagara. We're going to take examples from the Nayaka states of Tamil Nadu, and we're going to try and kind of adapt that to this alternate timeline where Vijayanagara did not fall.
Yeah, absolutely. Here on, everything that we're going to talk about is speculative, but that's the whole fun of it.
So, first of all, is the question of what would have happened at Talikota. We need to assume that the fears that the sultans had, that one of them would betray the others, would have actually come true. We would have had to have a situation where Ramaraya was perhaps not as abrasive as he was in our timeline, perhaps a little more diplomatic, and perhaps did not scare poor Ali Adil Shah as much as he actually did. And so we end up in a situation where at Talikota, the Ali Adil Shah perhaps comes over to Ramaraya's side, and the Sultanate's armies are smashed. So in the immediate aftermath, what would we see? Of course, given Ramaraya's obsession with Kalyana, there would have been this triumphant kind of expedition that would have crossed the Krishna River and penetrated deep into the northern Deccan. You would probably have seen Kalyana being established as a site of some kind of viceroyalty, perhaps directly controlled by a relative Ramaraya's, and you would have seen Ramaraya quite triumphantly adopting a very elaborate Chalukya titles. He would probably have called himself Maharaja Adhiraja, or perhaps even Sri Prithvi Vallabha, the ancient imperial title of the Deccan. More generally speaking, though, keeping in line with what Ramaraya generally did through his reign, you would have seen that he would have tried to remove the sultans that were not absolutely loyal to him. So he would have absolutely eradicated from the face of the earth the Nizam Shahi Sultanate. He would probably have captured Hussein Nizam Shah if he could have, otherwise he would have put him to death. He would have uprooted the Nizam Shahi royal family and kind of replaced it with people that were loyal to him. The Qutub Shahis, I mean, it really depends on what Ibrahim Quli Qutub Shah did on that fateful day, but it's probably likely that Ramaraya would have just had him replaced with more loyal Telugu-speaking Nayakas. More generally, also, you would have seen that the Sultanate territories would have been split up among his loyalists. Free reign would have been given to very powerful Nayakas under Ramaraya, such as the Ikkeri Nayaka. And you would very likely have also seen that major mercenary leaders and captains who served under Ramaraya would have been granted lands there. And this, of course, brings up a very interesting question, right? Would you have seen Ramaraya only giving lands and power to quote-unquote Hindus, to Telugu speakers, to Tamil speakers, to Kannadigas, to people of upper caste? I don't necessarily think so. I think that Ramaraya was very intelligent in terms of how he chose to recruit his human capital. As I mentioned a little earlier, there was a time when Bijapur was expelling Persian speakers, and Ramaraya was actually welcoming them into his court. So you would very likely have seen some Persian loyalists, especially in areas that had significant presence of quote-unquote Westerners, especially Iranians, Turks, and so on. You might very well have seen mercenary leaders, or at least Sayyids, or well-born, quote-unquote, well-born immigrants to the Vijayanagara court being appointed as governors, administrators, or even military leaders. So that broadly is what would have probably happened in the immediate aftermath of Talikota. But keep in mind, of course, that Ali Ramaraya was also extremely old by this point. He would not have lived very long to kind of see these political arrangements live to their fulfillment. And immediately after his death, given how ambitious we know Indian warlords generally are, you would have seen all of these guys going at each other's throats and trying to carve out their own kind of territories.
That is fascinating, Anirudh. And I want to get back to it and an exercise that you've done right after this short break.
Hey, everybody, let me tell you a little bit about what happened on the IBM Podcast Network this week. We've had some amazing stuff, right? I mean, I don't know if you're aware of the redoing or the rebranding of the Traveling Professors show. We called it now Smarter with Sid, which is our Deshmukh. This week he examines Netflix getting into e-commerce and will this affect how Amazon's dominating the space. Also, let me give you another quick hits to join up on. So on Cyrus Says, Cyrus was joined by Olympic equestrian Imtiaz Anis, and Nishan Burla from the Triangle Offense podcast showed up on Thursday's Cock and Bull to talk about the NBA Finals. On Nankari Sadaf and Archie were joined by Keshav Chaturvedi of the Tere Mere Raste podcast. On Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talked to Ashim Mathur from Dolby. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram to keep up with what's going on the network. And with that, let me also just finally thank our sponsors. They're what makes things possible. We'd like to thank Seat, Cred, Global Victoria, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, and Lenovo. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back, folks. We're joined by Anirudh Kanisetti, and we're discussing what might have happened if Vijayanagara survived. Now, Anirudh, you've actually done a very interesting exercise on this on Instagram, where you've actually imagined what it would be like to have this alternate history in which Vijayanagara survived. Can you run us through it? Because among other things, you have some very fascinating names for characters in that alternate history, don't you?
Yes. So I had a great time like this. This was like a month or so ago, or time's really a blur at this point, but basically what happened is that I got very excited about this idea, and like I got together like an artist, an art historian, and a map maker, and like the three of us, the four of us kind of sat together and tried to like figure out what could have happened. So the way we tried to do this was by trying to imagine a speculative art object. So let's say that in this alternate timeline in the 17th century, one of these new nayakas who have risen up in the northern Deccan creates some kind of text, some kind of art object, and now it has been discovered by a modern museum, and this modern museum is kind of talking about it as a historical object. That depicts a very interesting time in this alternate history. And so what we imagined was basically that similar to what the Nayaka courts of the Tamil country did, that this imaginary Nayaka court commissions a text to kind of explain its relationship to Vijayanagara and draw its legitimacy from there. A great example of this happening in our own timeline, the one that we live in today, is the Tanjavur Andhra Rajula Charitam. Now, this is something that was composed in Tanjore, as you can imagine, as the name says. It was commissioned by the Tanjore Nayakas. It's written in Telugu, and essentially what it does is it kind of lays out this great mythological spin on how Krishnaraya of Vijayanagara had sent these Nayakas down to enforce his will because the Pandyas needed his help or something, and the Pandyas were being really shady about something. So the Nayakas took power for themselves in order to help the people and to help Krishnaraya. And Krishnaraya kind of admits that just as he is an emanation of the god Krishna, this gentleman Nayaka who has taken over Tanjore is an emanation of the god Shiva, and therefore deserves kingship, and so on and so forth. Now, it's very interesting that all these things happened in our old timeline, because it shows that the way that these new entrants to Tamil Nadu are kind of legitimizing themselves is by drawing on the power and the memory of the Vijayanagara kings, and also drawing on ideas of kingship that were current in that area, and also associating themselves quite significantly with pre-existing Tamil powers. So what would have happened in the northern Deccan? The example that we chose was of this imaginary individual called Vitthal Mirza. Vitthal Mirza is the descendant of this Iranian mercenary who served in the armies of Ramaraya at Talikota, and as a reward for his activities was essentially given a small fief in the northern Deccan. And from there, in the aftermath of the death of Ramaraya, this gentleman kind of goes to war with all his neighbors, captures the great citadel of Dalutabad, and sets up a court there. Now, Vitthal Mirza is the son of this individual who initially started the kingdom, and now that he has come to power, now he's consolidated his power a little bit. What he does is that he commissions a text to justify his family's rise to power, and of course relate it to that of Vijayanagara history more broadly. Now, in this timeline, since, of course, Vijayanagara survives, Telugu courtly culture is still extremely important, and it actually has extended all the way deep into Maharashtra at this point. So this text is actually composed in Telugu, but because this individual is descended from a Persian man, the text really builds on the manuscript tradition of the Persianate world. So while it is in Telugu, it also has illustrations accompanying it, which is very unique, which is something that we see in the Persian world, but not so much in the Telugu literary world. And these illustrations, consulting with an art historian by the name of Akshaj Awasti, really cool guy. The idea that we came up with is that basically we take this Lepakshi style mural, which is late Vijayanagara from our own timeline, this Lepakshi style mural, which is like kind of flat, two-dimensional, and we use elements from the Persianate world. So this brilliant artist, friend of mine called Anirudh Shastrakar, kind of imagine this very colorful scene drawing on the colors and the imagery that are used in Deccan Sultanate art. So these very bright oranges, very deep ultramarine colors, and also the kind of landscapes that you see in Persian art. So these beautiful mountains away in the distance, that kind of thing. But a lot of the motifs that are familiar in Vijayanagara art. So, for example, he depicts this gentleman Vitthal Mirza in his court, and there are all these beautiful little niches with depictions of Ranganatha, with depictions of Nandi. There's a Brahmin minister sitting there, for example. But there are also like animals in the corner for fighting, thus connecting it to the ideals of Solomonic kingship that you see in Mughal art and also in the art of the Persianate world. So essentially, the idea that we are trying to convey with this little artwork is that it's a very interesting and cosmopolitan ethos that is perpetuated even after Vijayanagara's victory, because Vijayanagara saw itself very much as an early modern empire, right? It was very cosmopolitan. It prided itself in its cosmopolitanism, and of course, its successors, even living under Vijayanagara's shadow, would have tried to emulate a lot of these ideas. So that's broadly like some of the big ideas that we were playing with. We also like added in little details just for fun, So, for example, why is this guy calling himself Vitthal Mirza? In Madurai, for example, the Madurai Nayakas would claim that it was the goddess Meenakshi who invited them to come and take over. Similarly, Vitthala is this Maharashtrian god who was popular in Vijayanagara. We know that Krishna Raya, for example, built a temple to Vitthala, specifically almost to commemorate his victories over the Sultanates. So you would see this Persianate Nayaka calling himself Vitthala because he's trying to associate himself not only with an existing Maharashtrian god, but also associating himself with a popular deity with the Vijayanagara imperial center itself. And of course, because though in practice he rules as an independent ruler, he would try to use a syncretic title that justifies his rule as a successor both of the Sultanates and as an agent of Vijayanagara. So while the Vijayanagara kings call themselves Hindu Raya Suratrana, so Sultan among Hindu kings, this gentleman calls himself Amir Nayaka. So he is both an Amir and a Nayaka. Both of these terms literally mean leader, and both of them are vague enough to essentially allow him to reign as an independent ruler, paying lip service to Vijayanagara, while in practice drawing on the trappings of pre-existing kingship and religions in the region. And finally, just one last fun little detail before we move on is his wife. We called her Nargisa Mahadevi. So Nargis, but also Mahadevi, because she's a Vijayanagara-esque queen. And we depict her in this painting wearing this beautiful ultramarine sari with aquatic creatures on it, but also wearing a Turkish hat. And we say that she is a descendant of the Nizam Shahi family, who has kind of married into this new line, and who adopts again the trappings of both Vijayanagara queenship, but also the titles and ideas of the Nizam Shahi Sultanate.
Yeah. So what you are talking about here, Anirudh, is with all these colorful characters, is really an attempt to appeal both to something that's more universal and something that is very localized, right? So the immediate parallel that occurs to me is, of course, the Mughal Empire, and how they were able to both build political legitimacy of the empire and the dynasty, but also appeal to local power centers. And they also did this with language, right? You had Persian and later Urdu being these lingua francas, and at the same time, highly localized administration, highly localized use of language. And what I want to ask you is it very far-fetched to imagine this alternate timeline of Vijayanagara where Urdu or some sort of Creole language is the main lingua franca and in fact the language of the court?
That's an interesting question. The thing is that in our own timeline, we did see the emergence of this kind of language in the northern Deccan, right? So Dakhini was something that was spoken across much of the Deccan for the longest time, and only really came to an end after the Mughals came in and kind of imposed Urdu and Persian as state languages. But in this timeline, we would certainly have seen some kind of Creole, but the influences would have been very different. So, for example, if the courts are all patronizing Telugu now as a kind of a literature of the court, then you would expect to see a lot more kind of Telugu influence on these languages and on the emergence of new language cultures and so on. But it's interesting that you mentioned the Mughals, because that really was a major parallel that we were going for. The major difference being that we are not drawing a parallel between the Mughal Empire, this very powerful kind of Jagirdari apparatus, directly loyal to the emperor, where land estates are kind of revoked and re-established at the end periodically. But instead, a much more kind of decentralized system, continuing in the traditions of southern Indian kingship, and more similar really to Vijayanagara's way of doing things, where you would have these loyal Nayaka leaders, military leaders set up. You would have Telugu immigration kind of encouraged into these regions, and these Telugu peasant warriors would essentially set up their own kind of fortified settlements. They would involve themselves in local politics, and then they would gradually kind of rise up to become their own leaders, while also working within the edges of this new kind of highly cosmopolitan, multicultural system that would be emerging. Another interesting dynamic that we thought about is that if you suddenly have the extinguishing of all these powerful sultanates in the inland Deccan, then the Portuguese would probably have had a free reign in the Konkan. So you'd probably have seen much of the coast coming under Portuguese control, as at least in Maharashtra. They would have been controlled through a series of forts and so on. But given that all these kind of little Amira Nayakas would all be kind of fighting with each other like cats and dogs, there would have been little room for any kind of military complacency, similar to what Vijayanagara had in our timeline. So you would probably have seen all of these Nayaka courts kind of encouraging Portuguese mercenaries to kind of serve with them, and it's really not out of the question for them to have encouraged these Portuguese to come in and settle down, and kind of create families in the inland Deccan. So perhaps you would have seen like the emergence of this kind of Indo-Portuguese class that helped ensure that these Amir Nayaka states had access to cutting-edge weaponry and so on. We actually played with this idea as well in the kind of speculative historical artwork that we did. We had an image of this Indo-Portuguese gentleman who calls himself Afonso da Narsinga Pais. So Narsinga is what the Portuguese called the kingdom of Vijayanagara. So he calls himself da Narsinga because he's from Vijayanagara. And this gentleman also bears the title of Tupaki Setti. So it's a Telugu title. Tupaki is gun. Setti is merchant, so he also bears that title, and he essentially serves as both a mercenary captain and a procurer of weapons for the court of Vittal Mirza. So the idea really is to take dynamics that we know existed in our world, kind of tweak them based on some factors that in this alternate timeline, but broadly to ensure that the parallels kind of continue. I think the essence of a really successful alternate history exercise is to not indulge too much in kind of wish fulfillment. So this is not this glorious centralized Vijayanagara empire that emerges, because it does not make sense given what we know about Vijayanagara's political culture for that to have happened. Instead, what we see is far more interesting, if I dare say so, and far more just real, and just as violent and kind of morally complex and kind of messed up as our own history is.
Absolutely. And one of those things that might be messed up is, like you pointed out, the involvement of the Portuguese. I think you're absolutely spot on there. It's hard for me to imagine a world in which Vijayanagara survives where the Portuguese don't have an enhanced role in the subcontinent. It's almost a given. But if that were to happen, if you were to see this, like you said, sort of decentralized but still powerful Vijayanagara empire, and how would this is the big question that we both want to get into. How would this empire deal with the newly emerging empire in the north, the Mughals?
That's a very interesting question. We actually didn't get that far in the alternate history exercise because it just got like too detailed. My friend Arjunan tried to like create some maps depicting it and so on, but it just got really out of hand, which I think also like kind of shows that this is a successful alternate history exercise, because that is the nature of history, right? Like you cannot indefinitely project it centuries and centuries ahead, because it just gets too complicated. There's too many variables at play. Unlike some alternate history exercises which like start off in, I don't know, like with the Roman Empire surviving and like bringing it up to like 2000 AD and like having a world that looks much like our own. The reality of it is that we have no idea what would have happened. Like the entirety of the colonial period would have been totally different. Would you have even seen a British Raj? Would you have seen a Portuguese Raj instead? Would you have seen India partitioned between many European powers? Or would you have seen in India where military innovation is so cutting edge that India goes out and like, starts to colonize Africa or Australia or something like that? It's impossible to say. But specifically about the Mughals, that's a very interesting question, because by 1565, the Mughal state had kind of come back. It had kind of entrenched itself very well. And by the early 16th century, Akbar's career was already starting to be quite successful. And he was trying to experiment with a lot of the things that made the Mughal state so pervasive, especially the Jagirdari system, which I mentioned a little earlier. So you'd have had a situation where you'd have had very weak Vijayanagara authority north of the Krishna River. So between the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers, you would essentially have all these Amira Nayaka states going toward each other. Probably geopolitically speaking, you would have seen five major Nayaka states emerging, similar to the Deccan Sultanates. They would have followed the same kind of geopolitical patterns. And then sooner or later, you would have seen, by perhaps 1610 or so, you'd have seen Akbar trying to cross the Narmada and getting involved in these affairs. This is something that he did historically as well. He actually kind of crossed the Narmada and he made Berar into a Suba of the Mughal Empire. So would that really have happened in this timeline as well? The interesting thing is that Akbar actually faced multiple assassination attempts in our timeline. And he managed to survive all of them. Some of them came very, very close to actually taking his life. But he managed to survive, and as a result of that, the Mughal Empire was immeasurably strengthened. So, is there a guarantee, given all the other things that we are changing in this timeline, that Akbar would have survived? I don't think so. I mean, frankly speaking, it's very much possible that Akbar did not survive, and essentially a number of smaller kind of Mughal states emerged in northern India that were not able to kind of unite the Gangetic Plains, at least for another few decades. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that everything else does stay the same. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Akbar actually does survive. What happens to the Deccan then? I think the answer to that is nothing very pleasant, unfortunately. If Akbar had managed to like come and cross the Narmada and find these very divided small states, even if they were extremely innovative and were extremely multicultural and so on, unless they formed a coalition, perhaps under the leadership of Vijayanagara, which is kind of doubtful. I mean, it's really debatable whether Ramaraya's successors would have had his same talent at like deftly navigating people and binding them to his will. It's really up to debate. If there had not been a kind of coalition to kind of resist and fight back Akbar, it's very likely that in this timeline, you'd probably have seen the Mughals expanding much more rapidly than they did in ours. And especially if Akbar had been at the helm, as opposed to, say, Jahangir or Shah Jahan or eventually Aurangzeb. Of course, these people probably would have never existed, right? So if the divergent point from our timeline is 1565, then Jahangir, I don't think would have been born at the time. Neither would Nur Jahan have been born. So Akbar's successors would also have been very, very different people from what we know today. Would Akbar have encouraged a much more substantial Deccani presence in the Mughal court? Would you have seen a situation where the Mughals were producing Telugu texts because they wanted to appeal to this new kind of Deccan elite? We really don't know. It's insanely complex. It's insanely complicated. There's so many variables. But I'm curious, what do you think would have happened, Aditya?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because 1556, 9 years before the Battle of Talikota, is the second Battle of Panipat. It's really the moment that Akbar consolidates his own power. And what happens after that is really up for grabs. Like you said, there's so many assassination attempts on the guy. Who knows what might have happened? But even if he did survive, even if he did have competent successors and so on, I think that the very fundamental dynamic of the Mughal expansion into the Deccan would be so different. We don't know, if, for example, they would ever face a polity like the Marathas. It's just up for grabs. We don't know how they would have, Aurangzeb, for example, struggled not just against the Marathas, but really, pretty much every power that was in the Deccan. How would that have, how would that have played out, say, 100 years later after Talikota? It's one of those things where we can just speculate, and but it's an empty speculation. Again, to bring back the Portuguese, what's really interesting is what would the Mughal relationship have been like with the Portuguese if the Portuguese were seen to be heavily aligned with Vijayanagara? What might that have meant for Mughal trade? What might that have meant even for something as simple as being able to make the sea voyages for the Hajj? There are so many variables here up for grabs that really this ought to be a video game or something like that.
Yeah, that'd be super interesting. Incidentally, there are video games that do something like this. I don't know if our listeners have heard of Europa Universalis, which essentially is a simulator of like early modern geopolitics, where you kind of control a nation and go out and conquer and that kind of thing. But it's not realistic in the sense that you become like subject to geopolitical constraints the larger you grow. In fact, if anything, the game kind of encourages you to grow larger and larger. So I've played games where, as Vijayanagara, I've conquered the entire Indian subcontinent and like colonized Australia. I've had games where, playing as the Mughals, I've conquered the entire subcontinent, about half of China, sacked Beijing multiple times, colonized Australia and New Zealand, and then used that as a launching pad to colonize Hawaii, and then use Hawaii as a kind of invasion base to attack the Spanish Americas, so thus taking over Mexico and building the Panama Canal and so on. It's a ridiculous game, but it's a lot of fun. I think you actually brought up some interesting points there, Aditya, about how would the Mughals have seen these kind of Amira Nayakas, right? And this actually like brought up the question of like whether there could have been Nayaka states that were powerful enough to perhaps play off Vijayanagara and the Mughals against each other. And pardon me for being a little nostalgic about the Deccan. I just feel like the Northern Deccan got screwed over so many times. I want them to be successful for once.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about alternate history, right? It's very hard to avoid our wish fulfillments. But yeah, whatever it was, if things had been different, they would not have been things that we would necessarily like. At least, most of the stuff is just awful. But yes, I would really look forward to the famous Spanish Andhra Wars of the 17th century. That would be something interesting to read about. But yeah, Anirudh, thanks once again. This is I love to do episodes like this. Normally we are so staid, and we're focusing on actual history. We rarely indulge in speculation. So it's nice to really cut loose on an episode like this and just chat about what might have been. And what I will just say is that if you read history and history confirms all your biases, either you don't have a lot of biases for some strange reason, or you're reading history wrong, which is the most likely which is what is most likely true. So when we read history, don't I guess we should never expect to be satisfied by it. If history doesn't leave you disturbed, disappointed, but also more interested, maybe you should just read other books. So yeah, I just leave you with that, and I definitely look forward to having more such conversations with you, Anirudh, where we can explore more such alternate timelines and not just talk about the history that we all know about. And we'd also like to plug Yuddha. If you haven't heard about it, Yuddha is a military history podcast that Anirudh and I host. We completed the first season last year, and we are beginning a new season in about a month's time. So look forward to you joining us for Yuddha. We are going to explore precisely the sort of thing we explored in an episode like this. We're going to look at a real history, of course, and we're going to look at how messed up it is, how challenging it is, how disturbing it is, and how absolutely fascinating it is. So if you are interested in history that challenges you and interests you, definitely check out Yuddha. We'd love to have you join us. Anirudh?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing what Aditya said, India's history is messy, and what I really love about it, and what ensures that I keep coming back to history through all these years that I've been like making history content, is the fact that it helps me see India in so many new ways, because it challenges other biases in my own thinking, and it shows me that the reality of history is just like the reality of today. It's confusing, it's messy, it's not the kind of world that we would like to see, but it is the world that made ours the way it is today. And there is so much to learn about ourselves and about humanity from trying to grapple with the reality of what went down in our past. So yeah, check out Yuddha. And also, if you're interested in more ancient periods of Indian history, then check out my Echoes of India podcast, where I talk about ancient India's social, religious, and philosophical history, and kind of try to understand how the ideas that originated in these many, many centuries before us continue to shape the world that we live in today.
Yeah, I would like to echo Anirudh's recommendation. Definitely check out Echoes of India. It's a fun podcast above all else. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we look forward to doing more such episodes on all things policy.
Thank you.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Want to learn something new and have a few minutes to spare? Well, then go for the Traveling Professor's Diary, where I, Siddharth Deshmukh, the Traveling Professor, will help you glean from all the insights that I've gained from wherever I've traveled, learned, taught, and repeated. Join me every Tuesday and Thursday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.